fight to hold on. We must ignore the forces that come for surrender. It's always darkest just before time. Even when your heart is tired and broken, we have a Redeemer who loves us, protects us as we walk through the fire. His name lifted higher. Nothing can ever separate us from the love of God. Those not awakened, whose faith may be shaken, only through Jesus is freedom and eternity. Chaos, distractions, corruption, fear, rejection, and the reckoning is here. Manufactured divisions, the enemies within. We will expose them down with winds. We walk through the fire. He's lifted higher. Nothing can ever separate us from the love of God. Who's not awakened, whose faith may be shaken, only through Jesus is freedom and eternity. Walk through the fire.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, wherever you're at. It's morning here in Hawaii, but I know it's afternoon for a lot of you. So, welcome. So this is Bill Donahue with Discerning Truths. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I teach through the Bible. Monday and Wednesday, I in books of the Bible. Friday, I do Bible-related subjects. Sometimes only a little related, right? So. We started our introduction to Matthew on Monday. I always go through the 5 interrogatory questions, the who, what, when, where, and why of a book to set the context so that we understand what's happening. As I explained on Monday, there is a lot of controversy about Matthew, who wrote it, who was it written to, when was it written. These are all controversial. So there was enough that I couldn't do it all in one shot. So we're going to finish it today, the introduction. Then next Monday, I will get into the gospel. On Friday, I plan to have, I get the same questions often, like over and over again. And so I just want to kind of go over that and the 10 most common questions I get, right? And so with that, I'm going to get started, and then because I want to be done on time. Michael does a prayer for the nation every Wednesday. I want to be done in time for him. So in part 1, we covered the who and what questions. Who wrote the Gospel of Matthew? I think it's the Apostle Matthew. Some scholars disagree. Who was the original audience of the Gospel of Matthew? I think they were Jews, okay, clearly. Some scholars think it was Jews and Gentiles, right? What's the Gospel of Matthew about? It's basically the life of Christ. It's a quasi-biography. It skips the big chunks of his life, but it hit major themes. What were the major themes of the Gospel of Matthew, right? And we kind of went through those themes. And what's the outline? And I gave you an outline that, and I even forgot where I stole it. I think it was Logos, but I got it out of somebody. They had a decent outline for the gospel, and I produced it for you. And then, what are the scriptural sources for the Gospel of Matthew? Matthew uses both Hebrew text and Greek text of the Old Testament, showing that whoever wrote Matthew could read both. And I give you arguments why I believe the Apostle Matthew would have had to been fairly fluent in both. And then what are the controversial issues in the Gospel of Matthew? Like, you know, not including the genealogy. I'm not going to hit the genealogy until Monday. But we try to go over some of the controversies over, you know, what's going on in the Gospel of Matthew. So that's what we covered Monday. And today we're going to look at the next one. So we did the who and the what. Obviously, the next question is the when. When was the gospel written, right? And surprise, surprise, there's another controversy. There's a late date. Okay, so I want you to understand, liberal scholars, these are professing Christian scholars in what came to be known as German liberalism, 18th and 19th century, okay, then moving into the 20th century, argued that none of the Gospels were written until the 2nd century. None of them were written by apostles, okay, that these were all late. Well, the problem is we have copies, fragmenting, but copies of some of the Gospels that date to either the very late 1st century or very early 2nd century. And I don't know where you come from, but where I come from, copies don't exist before the original. So if you have copies already circulating and making their way around the world by the 2nd century, you have to have them written earlier. So when manuscripts like the P52, John Ryland's papyrus P52, will fit in the palm of your hand. It's a small piece of a manuscript containing a portion of the Gospel of John. Well, the general consensus is it's dated to about 125 to 150 AD. Some dates have put it into the 90s AD, but the general consensus is in the early 2nd century. Okay? And because of that, this idea that the Gospels weren't written till the 2nd century kind of went away. And you had other ones like P56. It's almost a near complete copy of the Gospel of John, and it's dated a little later, about 150 to 200 AD. And P45 containing portions of all 4 Gospels, dated to 200 to 250. So because of these manuscript discoveries, this argument that they weren't written till the 2nd century has largely gone away. You will still see people on Instagram and the internet claiming that this is what scholars believe. I don't know of any scholar, any textual critic, that still holds this position. Okay, but you can find old books where it was the position. It was the position when I was in college. Okay. So, early Christian writers from the late 1st and 2nd centuries either quote or allude to the Gospels, including their evidence for authority of the late 1st century. Okay, Clement of Rome, he's writing in 95 to 96 AD, right, in 1st Clement, and he alludes to Matthew and Luke in his letter, suggesting that these Gospels were well known to Clement by 90 or 96 AD. Well, they couldn't have been written after that if he knew about them by the end of the 1st century. Ignatius of Antioch in about 110 AD references material from Matthew, John, and possibly Luke in his epistle. Papias, he was a big deal in our last one because he's the one that insisted that Matthew wrote first, right? He's from 100 to 130 AD. Now, we don't have Papias' writings, but Eusebius, in Ecclesiastes Histories, quotes him extensely. And so what we know about Papias comes from Eusebius, who's a much later historian, but he would have still had the writings of Papias, right? And he insisted that Matthew wrote his gospel first, and there's a dispute over whether it's Hebrew or Aramaic in his native tongue, okay? And then the people were translating it the best they could, which makes me think it was Hebrew, because a lot of people would have spoke Aramaic, but only the learned Jews in and around Judea would have spoken Hebrew. So he likely wrote it in Hebrew, and they were struggling translating it, right? And so it got rewritten in Greek. And that's the copy that we have, the Greek one. In fact, there's even discussions among people that said that they preferred the earlier version than the Greek version. So it's kind of interesting that modern scholarship has abandoned all that evidence to say, oh no, we think Mark wrote first. Okay? 1800 and something years later, we're going to decide Mark wrote first, even though all the early references say Matthew wrote first, right? Now, John's gospel addresses Christological issues, like Jesus being the Word in John 1:1, right? And these are rooted in first century Jewish theology rather than second century Gnostic controversies. And this is one of the ideas that people have floated for years, was that this idea of Jesus as the Word was a Gnostic idea. Well, Alan Siegel, in his book, he's a Jewish theologian, not a Christian, in his book, Two Powers in Heaven, documented beyond any reasonable doubt that in Judaism in the first century, there was a widespread belief in what's called two powers in heaven. And one of those powers goes by the name, the logos, the word in Greek, okay? Memra in Aramaic. And that they were there. So John took an existing idea that was already in Judaism and said, you want to know who the logos is? I'm going to explain to you who the logos is. Okay, who's that second power? And he does this. So that kind of refuted this idea from scholars that, hey, since John's using ideas that we know existed in Gnosticism in the second century, he must have written in the second century. No, the Gnostics borrowed from John, not the other way around. And that's absolutely shown to be the case now. The Gospels don't reflect the theological or ecclesiological. Ecclesias is the church development in the second century, such as debates over Gnosticism, okay? And formalized in church hierarchies and the Montanist movement. None of that's in the gospel. You see early addresses to Gnosticism in the writings of Paul and the letters of John, right? Kind of what I would call proto-Gnosticism. The early ideas of Gnosticism get dealt with there. The Gospels make no mention of that. They don't, which provides internal evidence that the Gospels are earlier. And John's Gospel addresses, oh, wait a second. You have, did I miss something? Oh, you have an absence to references to later events, like the destruction of the temple, okay? And then you got the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135, okay? So I think the destruction of the temple not being mentioned puts it pre-70 AD, but they say that the critics had always said that Jesus actually didn't predict the destruction of the temple, but the writers put those words in Jesus's mouth after 70 AD to make it seem like Jesus spoke prophecy. Okay? This whole liberal idea is to destroy the credibility of the Bible. And it has made huge headways in Christian scholarship, and even in Christian conservative schools teach a lot of this nonsense. Okay? Now, the middle date, which is more common now, and that most modern scholars say to hold to the late date of 70s to 100 AD, you have a move towards a middle date that is a little, so they gave up on the 100 to 200 AD, and now they're in a middle date 70 to 100, and the liberal scholars have landed there. The synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and they're called synoptic because they basically follow the same scenario, the same quasi-chronology, where John does not. He writes, seems independent of those gospels, right? And because Jesus predicts the temple, the destruction of the temple, and they're starting with the presupposition that prophecy cannot exist. Therefore, the fact that Jesus talks about one stone not being left upon another, that must have been written after the fact. Okay? Do you see how the premise of this argument is the Bible cannot possibly speak prophecy? Therefore, when Jesus does speak prophecy, it's got to be history written as prophecy. Okay? But I'm telling you, conservative Christian schools teach this. They don't teach it in the way I just did to tell you that the premise behind this means that you're denying the Bible teaches prophecy, but they teach it. I went to Biola, considered a very conservative school. I was taught this crap. Okay? Now, most scholars have ignored the universal testimony, and when I say universal, only a few of the early church fathers talked about who wrote what gospel when. But among that few, they all agree Matthew wrote first. Nobody suggests Mark wrote first. They toss all of that out, and they came up with this idea, okay, that it was written later. And then they hold on to that idea. Now, Mark is often dated around the time of the Jewish Wars, 66 to 70 AD, due to its urgent tone and focus on persecution. Now, I guarantee you persecution increased 66 to 70 AD with the Jewish Wars, right? The turbulent 60s. But some scholars, like Martin Hengel, right, in studies in the Gospel of Mark, placed Mark just after 70 AD. They're still arguing for this late date for Mark. And if Mark's first, then nobody else is before 70 AD. Okay? So these are, this is what you're taught. You go to seminary, you're taught not to believe the Bible, apparently, and you do this. And I want you to understand, this idea came out of the view of Scripture, popular in the 18th to the early 20th century, right? That came out of liberal scholarship to undermine the idea that God predicts the future and causes it to come to pass. But what does Isaiah 46, 9-11 say? Remember the former things of old, for I am God, there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish my purpose, calling a bird of prey from the east, and the man of my counsel from far country. I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed, and I will do it. So Isaiah says, records God saying, I told you in a long time ago, and I'm telling you now stuff that hasn't happened, and I'm going to make it happen. The Bible is based on the idea of predictive prophecy. But there's always been people that have argued that when prophecy is too accurate for their taste, that it must have been written after the fact. The book of Daniel is so extremely accurate in how wars were fought, who was involved in all that stuff, that there were people arguing that the book of Daniel could not have been written when it said it was written, and it must have been written later because it is so accurately presenting history. Well, maybe it's the book of Daniel is prophecy from a God who knows history before it's written and causes that history to come to pass. So now you're going to get to me. I hold the early date along with a lot of conservative scholars. And they are arguing that the Gospels were written in the 40s to 60s AD. Okay? And here's our reasoning. The Gospels reflect a first century Jewish Palestinian setting consistent with the time of Jesus. Now, there's a debate whether Jesus died in 30 AD or 33 AD. Some people even pick 31 and 32, but the two most popular dates for Jesus' crucifixion, and this is based on arguments from different stuff, are either 30 or 33 AD. Okay? Jewish customs and temple practices. The Gospels describe details of Jewish life before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. For example, in Matthew 5:23 to 24, references to temple offerings. And Luke 2:41 and 42 mentions Passover pilgrimage, detailing less relevant details. So they didn't make pilgrimages to the temple after 70 AD because the temple didn't exist. So, and none of the Gospels make reference to the destruction of the temple other than in prophecy, right? In Mark 13:1 and 2, they do not explicitly mention its fulfillment. It's talked about prophetically, but if they were written after the fact, wouldn't the author have Luke said, Jesus predicted this, and then it came to pass, showing the proof. And then you had early Christian concerns. The gospel addresses issues like Jewish and Gentile relations, which were problematic from the beginning. Even in the writings of Paul, what's the role of the Mosaic law? You see that in Matthew 15, where Jesus says, I didn't come to destroy the law, I came to fulfill it. Well, what does that mean? How does the practicing of law fit in the Christianity? That's all first century stuff. There's no reason for a writer in the second century to include that because it was already settled by then. Now, most people believe the Gospels rely on oral tradition, that they didn't write them like on resurrection afternoon. They had oral tradition that went on for a while before they wrote it. They record eyewitness accounts. Luke says he interviewed eyewitnesses to get his information. He has information in Luke's gospel that could have only come from Mary because she was the only person to witness it. I mean, that's pretty clear. And then a second century date would make the authors too far away. They could not have possibly interviewed eyewitnesses or got eyewitness testimony. Right? In Luke's prologue, in Luke 1:1-4, he says he consulted eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Right? And Paul's letters, now this is important. Paul wrote from the 50s to the early 60s, probably 60 AD. Might be a little later than 60, but right in that kind of time frame. In one of his earliest letters, 1 Corinthians, in chapter 15, 3-8, he gives what is called the earliest Christian creed about Jesus dying under Pilate and after 3 days being resurrected, and he does all that. And he says, I gave to you when I first came what I was given, what came to me. And if you date 1 Corinthians and then you go back to Paul's life for when he met with the apostles and got that information, what was first given to him, you're within months or at maximum 5 years of the resurrection. Okay? There's some question about dates, and depending on whether you use 31 or 33 AD, if you're in 33 AD, Paul may have gotten his information from the apostles within months of Jesus's resurrection. But at worst case, it's no more than 5 years. Okay? Well, if based on that gospel already existed for Paul to be given and for Paul to give to the Corinthians, puts it very, very early. Now, some New Testament texts written in the first century appear to show or assume knowledge of gospel traditions, like 2 Peter 1:16-18, which most scholars date in the 80 to 90 AD. I don't think it's 80 to 90 AD since Peter's dead by then, okay? I think it's in the 60s AD, but it references the Transfiguration, and that story is found in the Synoptic Gospels, suggesting that the 2 Peter. Now, these scholars are arguing that Peter didn't write 2 Peter. And I don't think Peter penned it. I think Jude penned it for him, but that at Peter's instructions, just like the Gospel of Mark is the Gospel of Peter as written down by Mark. In 1 Timothy, 5:18, and this is 60 to 64 AD, quotes the laborer deserves his wages, a phrase found in Luke 10:7, indicating a possible use of Luke's gospel for that shared source. Okay? That means Paul, writing to Timothy, has access to Luke's gospel. Since Luke is Paul's companion, that makes total sense. But you're also going to see that they're there. So for these arguments are why people like me that hold to an earlier date do it, right? Now, there is a minority view held by scholars like N.T. Wright and John Wenham. Now, I personally like N.T. Wright, but he is a very nuanced writer. And you know, he's as hard to get to stick to a position as Jello to a wall. You know, I mean, he's very nuanced. I'm not real impressed with his new perspective on Paul and stuff, so I'm not 100% his fan. And he tries to peel out this middle ground. And so he's trying to say, yeah, they might not have written the Gospels, but they were probably using material written by the apostles. Okay? Now, this theory that I was talking to you about that Mark wrote first is called Markian priority. And Matthean priority means that Matthew wrote first. Big theological words, but that's what they mean, right? And most scholars, modern scholars, reject Matthean priority, favoring Markian. So they're saying that Mark wrote first, not Matthew, and followed by Matthew and then Luke. And they argued that Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their primary sources, that they all used a source known as Q, or Quell. It's not Q like the guy that dropped all the stuff. It's a German word. Quell means source, and it's abbreviated Q. They have since added 2 additional unknown sources, one called M and L, and M is for material only in Matthew, and L is for material only in Luke. Okay? And so they've constructed this whole big old scenario about how things get written, right? Now, the textual evidence, and what they did is they're looking at the Gospels, and they find that there are places where even the wording is exactly the same, okay? And so that they're going, well, they seem to be copying the same material. Well, if Matthew copied Mark, or Mark copied Matthew in those sections, or they both copied an earlier writing of Jesus' sayings, that would explain it. You don't have to have Mark write first. They also prefer harder readings. Okay? So like Mark 3:5, where Jesus looks around and in anger does something, and Matthew and Luke seem to admit or soften that idea of Jesus being angry. Okay? Well, that's easy to explain. You get 3 or 4 witnesses of a car accident, they're going to have similar views, but not exactly the same view. Same thing with a crime. Okay? But scholars say, no, we think Matthew and Luke intentionally softened that to make Jesus not seem angry. But Mark, being early, he didn't know to soften it, so he had Jesus angry. You know, you see what they're reading into the text? They also think there's a tendency to redact, to edit, and to do this. And Matthew and Luke exhibit consistent patterns in modifying Mark's text according to these scholars, right? Now, Matthew uses the kingdom of heaven instead of the kingdom of God that you're going to find when Jesus says the parables about the kingdom of God. The kingdom of heaven is a more Jewish phrase, where kingdom of God is not necessarily, and they think Matthew used it. They're the same thing. It's not like 2 different things. And unless you think that the Bible had to contain the exact words of Jesus, if it could have contained the essence of what he meant, not his verbatim words like they were taking dictation, then those kind of differences are not a problem. But they look at him and they go, no, I think Matthew intentionally changed the words of Jesus to make him sound more Jewish. Other arguments for Markian priority are the order of events. The order of events in Mark are generally followed by Matthew and Luke, with additional material inserted and rarely changing Mark's sequence supporting the idea that Mark was the base text. Well, what if Mark abbreviated the information that was in Matthew? Because it's Peter giving a oral speech and he abbreviated the events. Just because one happens and they seem similarities, it does not follow that therefore the shorter one was necessarily first. You have historical context. Again, they argue the destruction of the temple in AD 70 is spoken of prophetically in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Okay, so again, see this subtle undermining of scripture? They think Mark wrote first, but he didn't have Jesus give the prophecy. Matthew and Luke wanted to add the prophecy later, so they put the prophecy in the mouth of Jesus. That makes Matthew and Luke dishonest. Okay? These are people that died for their faith. But they're starting with this premise. And I'm telling you, be careful of Christian scholars. Because even the best, they have been taught this nonsense. You have what's called a Q hypothesis, and that's from Quell, right? The German Quell. And that they do that. And like I said, they have added sources L and M. They're all hypothetical. They have never been found. No early church father ever mentioned them. There's not these are an idea that was 100% fabricated. Imagine if there was never any. I'm gonna connect this to the modern Q phenomenon. Imagine there was never any post on the internet from this supposed Q source. And then somebody come back and said, well, this fulfills a prediction made by Q. No, I don't have Q sources. No, you can't find Q sources. Nobody ever mentioned any Q sources, but I'm telling you, Q existed. You'd laugh them out of the room. But that's exactly what they teach in seminary. That's something that nobody's ever seen, nobody has ever heard of, no early church father ever mentions, not supported in any document anywhere, is absolutely true. But what we have, the record of the early church fathers in writing, that you can dismiss. Okay? So how do we rebut this besides me making fun of it? Okay? You have early church testimony. And like I said, it's only a few early church fathers, but they unanimously agree Matthew wrote first. There's no evidence for Q ever existing. It's a hypothetical situation. Matthew's more developed theology, the emphasis on Jesus as the Messiah and the fulfillment of prophecy, could be due to the intended audience rather than the data composition. According to the early church fathers, Peter was in Rome speaking and to people there, and that Mark wrote down what he said. So these are probably not Jews, the majority of them. And supposedly he's speaking in Latin. Okay? And Matthew is writing to Jews. The fulfilled prophecy is going to make more sense to a Jew than some Roman. So you don't need to say that Matthew has a more developed theology because he's writing later. He has a different audience. Now you have statistical analysis of the synoptic gospels have been interpreted as supporting Matthew priority, at least in questioning Markan priority. Okay? Now Monsignor de Salagis in 1959 did this and showed areas where it seemed like Matthew wrote first. This is the minority of opinion among scholars, but it's there. And while Mark's order of event is generally followed, there are instances where Matthew and Luke differ from Mark, which some see as evidence against Markan priority, suggesting that Matthew could have been the base text, not Mark. And like I said, if you're going to go with the idea that the gospel writers had access to the other gospels and use them for part of their sources, whether it's Mark copying from Matthew or Matthew copying from Mark, in those places where they're identical. Both arguments can be made. Now, language and style is another area where we can rebut this. There's an argument that Mark's Greek is too simple for it to be based on Matthew, and is countered by suggesting that Mark might have been written for a different audience or purpose, such as a Greek-speaking community needing explanation of Aramaic terms. Like in Mark 7:11, he explains what the Aramaic terms are. And I'm saying, if Mark's writing down Peter writing in Latin for a Roman audience, it makes sense that he's going to do that. When you speak, you don't use the same formal English, at least most of us don't, as when we write. There is internal evidences in the Gospel of Mark that it was a spoken text that got written down. Exactly what the historians, our church history says happened, that Peter spoke it and Mark wrote it down. The inclusions of Aramaic terms in Mark could suggest it was written for a Greek-speaking audience, but does not necessarily mean it was written in Matthew. I'm not suggesting Peter was completely fluent in Latin. They were in Roman-occupied Judea and Galilee. They probably needed to know some Latin, but Greek is going to be the lingua franca, the actual intermediary. But I suggest that many of the apostles probably knew some Latin at least, that they are clearly understood Greek because they quote the scripture in Greek, right? We think of them as some ignorant people that didn't have any knowledge. But history says Peter was teaching in Latin. Well, I speak Spanish. I don't know every word in Spanish. If you're a fluent Spanish speaker, you're going to say I butcher Spanish, right? I'm assuming that Peter's mastery of Latin is no better than my mastery of Spanish, and that Mark was trying to be true to that, and where Peter inserted Aramaic words because he didn't know what the Latin word was, that Mark explains them, those Aramaic terms. That makes total sense. I don't need Mark to write first, right? And then you get the simplicity of language in Mark is easily explained by the actual historical record, and I quoted it for you here, okay? The elder, and the elder here we're talking about is Papias, being quoted by Eusebius. And the elder said this also: Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward. And I said he followed Peter, who adapted his teachings to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account to the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error when he thus wrote the things as he remembered them, for he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things that he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely. Okay? So this tells you exactly. Matthew's not one of the apostles. Matthew comes along later. Or not Matthew, John Mark. Comes along later. If you remember with Peter, John Mark goes out with Paul and Barnabas. He goes home, runs home to mama. Paul doesn't want him back. Barnabas wants to give him a second turn. And John Mark goes off with Barnabas. Later in Paul's ministry, you see Mark back in there. But in the meantime, he's hooked up with Peter. And he's helping Peter with the language issue. Because, as I said, I don't think Peter's as fluent in the other languages as some of the other apostles. And Mark is helping him. And Luke calls Peter unlettered, and I don't take that to mean illiterate, but that he doesn't have a formal education. And that makes total sense as in the job of a fisherman, right? And like I said, there's internal evidence in the Greek of the Gospel of Mark that it's written in the way a person speaks, right? Luke tells us from Peter that they're unlettered. and Bart Ehrman, he's an atheist, former Christian who's an atheist, one of our biggest critics, and he takes that and makes a big deal out of it that they're there. Now, this whole issue about who wrote first is called in theology the synoptic problem. Makes you think there's a problem. There's not a problem. All you got to do is let the text of history mean what they say, and the problem goes away. It's a problem when you want to argue that the Bible didn't predict prophecy, that the Bible can't be trusted. And why this garbage is being taught in seminaries is beyond me. But it is. And it says, where was the Gospel of Matthew written? Where was Matthew at when he wrote the Gospel? He doesn't tell us. But it is commonly suggested that he was somewhere in Palestine, in ancient Israel, Judea, right? Or Galilee, in that kind of area. Probably around Judea. If he was still operating as a tax collector and he's in area of Judea, it's fine. Some people that argue for the later date, argue for Antioch in Syria, okay? Because it's a mixed community. See, in the late date thing, if you remember from who it was written to, they think it was written to Jews and Gentiles. Early date people think he wrote to Jews. There might have been a sprinkling of Gentiles, but it was primarily to Jews. I hold that early date, and I think the Gospel of Matthew is clear that it's written to Jews. But again, this argument of where he wrote from, it's all based on the assumptions from liberal scholarship that Matthew was writing to a Greek-speaking Jews in direct contradiction to every written record we have. Now, I'm not saying the records that there's hundreds of them. I'm telling you there's only a few. But they all agree on this point that Matthew wrote first and wrote to Jews in his native tongue. He wouldn't have wrote to Greek-speaking Jews in his native tongue. Okay? So why did Matthew write his gospel? So the primary purpose of the Gospel of Matthew was to present Jesus as a Messiah to unbelieving Jews and to Jewish Christians, demonstrating that he fulfilled Old Testament prophecies and was the promised king from David's line. When we get to the genealogy in Matthew 1 to 17, I'm going to show you how Matthew stresses this connection to David. Now, he has secondary purposes, including the need that it ultimately has to address Jewish and Gentile audiences, even though the primary audience is Jewish, right? He wants to preserve the Jewish tradition while embracing Gentile inclusion. And you see that in the Great Commission in Matthew 28, 19, and 20. And it says, go there and make disciples of all nations. He wants to resolve tensions regarding the Mosaic law observance as reflected by Jesus' teaching. Remember, Matthew's a Levi. This is a big issue for him. So he includes Jesus saying, do not think I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, to fulfill them. His gospel is to guide the community living out their faith after Jesus, after the death and resurrection, emphasizing obedience to God's will. It's not some cheap grace, come up and accept Jesus and go live like you want. In Matthew 7:21, he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. See? Now, Paul does this in Romans 6 and 7, but Matthew includes it also. The gospel also reflects a struggle and conflicts with other Jews, particularly the scribes, chief priests, and Pharisees, positioning the kingdom of heaven as taken from them and given to the church, kind of this replacement theology stuff, okay? Which I've told you before. There is one natural olive tree, that is Jesus. He is the true Israel. The natural olive branches are ethnic Israel. The wild olive branches are us who are not Israelite by blood, and we are grafted in. But we did not replace Israel. We are all getting our the believers that are Jews and Gentiles, all are coming out of the same olive tree, which is Jesus. Okay? And in Matthew 21:43, it says, "Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will not be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits." All right? Will be taken away from you. Not will not be. Will be taken away from you. See, he's trying to tell them they think they're exclusive to the children of God, right? That they, by nature of being Jew by birth, are saved. And he's saying, no, the Old Testament taught that God was going to call a people that are not a people and make a people of his own. It's not that it's being taken away from you. You were never it. It was the true Israel, not ethnic Israel, that was always the promise. The true Israel is the Messiah. It is the Christ. It's the faithful servant, all seen in the Old Testament. And it's going to be taken from people it was offered to freely. Some branches are broken off, taken from, and other branches are grafted in, given to. But what is given to them and what is taken from them? The right to be plugged into the Messiah. It's not us replacing Israel. It's both of us depending on Christ. So this is the who, what, when, where, and why. And like I said, on Monday, I'm going to get into the genealogy, and there's enough controversies with genealogy that I got to break chapter 1 into 2 parts. I'll do the first 17 verses. We'll hit the genealogy Monday, and then I'll finish Matthew 1 on Wednesday. On Friday, I'm gonna answer the 10 most common questions I get, and give you the answers to those. So it's my practice normally to what do you call it? After I'm done the teaching, to put on a song, and then I will come back after the song, and I'll talk to you a little bit, see if there's any questions I can answer, and then I'll do what used to be my introduction. So I played the regular knees Monday. I think I'm going to do the groove version of knees. We need a little upbeat stuff, right? You know. So I'll be back after the song.
worship you alone. You will come to take me home.
You are all I ever need. Jesus, you have set me free. I will worship you alone. You will come to take me home. You are all I ever
You are all I
need.
need.
Jesus, you have set
You
me
set me free.
I will worship you
I will
alone.
worship you.
You will come to take me home.
I've fallen on my knees. I will bless the Lord. Do, 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 do. Oh, oh, oh.
Okay, we're rapidly approaching the top of the hour, so I want to get through this quickly. Little housekeeping. I don't know what's going on with D-Live. Monday it told me I wasn't streaming, but it did stream. Today it told me I'm not streaming and it's not streaming. So D-Live's a little hooky. I'm glad some people found YouTube. Foxhole is usually very steady. Rumble's been very steady for me. So just, it's always good to have a backup. If you like my content, have a backup place you can watch it, because it's like, it seems like almost every broadcast, one platform or another doesn't want to work, right? You know, but D-Live right now is giving me fits, and I have no idea why. So Mr. 20 brings up an issue about Q, not the Q theological source, but the Q drops. And so I don't usually talk about this. I want to make sure we're clear. I was very late to that game. In fact, I didn't read them while they were happening. My good friend Miguel California was very much involved. In fact, he was quoted by Q 5 times. He used to call it being Q'd. He goes, "Oh, you got to come over. You got to come over there." So I wasn't invested. And then after it quit dropping, I felt like I had to go find him, figure out what all the hoopla was about. And at the time, the only place I could find him was on 8chan. Oh my God, it's like a porn site. My eyes, I want to bleach them after I ever got in there. I finally read him, and I read all the Q drops in one sitting and went, okay, interesting. What's the big deal? Then I started reading Anons and how they were interpreting it. And I went, oh, this is the controversy. So while the Q stuff is mostly asking questions, and I didn't find anything amazingly controversial in them, some of the interpretations of that were. Now, some people felt burned by him. I know Miguel California is hostile to the Q community over that stuff. I wasn't invested. I don't have hostility. I have friends that are both still very much part of Q community, and people that are very hostile to it. To me, it's a interesting curiosity. But in the community, in the patriot community as large, there has been this movement to make Donald Trump like a messiah figure. And I would tell you this from my perspective, Trump 45 was the best president in my lifetime. And in 6 months, Trump 47 has outdone all the good that Trump 45 ever did. I mean, he has surpassed the old record, set new bar. So I have high regard of this president. But there's a problem. And we had a bunch of Trump prophets talking to him about like God's Cyrus, God's chosen one, all this other stuff. That's dangerous. I don't care where you come from. That's dangerous thinking. He's a politician that's enacting policies that I like, generally. I mean, there are some things I would like to see arrests. Okay. You know, I like to see somebody in jail for some of the stuff that's gone on. But, you know, I mean, there's there. I don't believe the story that, you know, the Epstein thing is bogus. But, you know, I'm trusting him that there's a reason why we're not coming out with that yet. But it's there. But there is a caution. It's a valid point you make that when people start treating Trump like a Messiah figure, there's only one God and one Lord, and that's Jesus Christ. Okay? One mediator between God and man. I don't put anybody else in that platform. Anybody that does, I don't care whether you're whether you love Q or hate Q, you do that, you're in dangerous land, in my opinion. So with this, I'm going to get out of here today, and like I said, Michael's going to be on in about a minute. So any of you that want to go over and watch Michael and listen to the Prayer for America, I understand. Right now, I'm just going to do an exit song and close my show down. And thank you for being here, and God willing, I'll see you on Friday. Okay?
Your worries and troubles, he's not from above. Walk boldly and bless those around you. Exhort mercy and love, even when the darkness may surround us. He's the Father that won't let go. Walk through